We got a call who didn't look like they belonged here. I need to see some ID.
I live here. I'm literally washing my car in my own driveway.
Just cooperate and we'll be done here.
You're really going to do this?
Sir, don't make this harder than it needs to be. Now.
The silence that came after lasted exactly 4 seconds. But in those 4 seconds, Officer Trevor Castellano's whole world fell apart. The man he had just ordered to cooperate, the person he had judged as someone who didn't look like he belonged, was not just a regular citizen. He was a police officer, a 15-year veteran of the department, a decorated sergeant. And as of 3 weeks ago, he was Castellano's direct supervisor in the East Division Patrol Unit. This was not going to be a simple call that Castellano could write up and forget. This was a career-ending moment, one that would be studied in police academies for years. And the worst part was that Castellano's own body camera was recording every word. Trevor Castellano had been on the police force for 4 years. He was 28 years old, married, and believed he was a good cop. He grew up in a mostly white suburban neighborhood about 30 miles from the city where he now worked. His father had also been a police officer, and Castellano had dreamed of following the same path since he was young. He went through the police academy, graduated somewhere in the middle of his class, and was assigned to the East Division. His record looked solid. He had received 14 commendations for good police work. He had made several strong arrests, helped with community events, and his supervisors consistently rated him as capable and reliable. But there was another part of Castellano's file that had never really been dealt with. Over his 4 years on the force, he had received 9 complaints from citizens. These complaints accused him of racial profiling or inappropriate behavior. Every single complaint came from Black or Latino residents. All 9 were investigated, and all 9 were marked as unfounded or unsubstantiated. Those investigations had been handled by his former supervisor, Lieutenant Vernon Kowalski. Kowalski was known for protecting his officers and often dismissed civilian complaints as people trying to avoid responsibility for lawful police actions. Kowalski had retired 6 months earlier. The new supervisor of Castellano's unit was someone completely different. Someone from another division. Someone Castellano had never worked under before. His name was Darnell Whitmore. Darnell Whitmore was 38 years old and had spent 15 years with the department. He started as a patrol officer, worked his way up to detective, and later moved into a supervisory role. His record was outstanding. He had received 2 Medals of Valor for bravery under fire, led dozens of successful investigations, and was known as tough but fair. For the past 5 years, Whitmore had lived in the Riverside neighborhood, one of the nicer areas in the city. His home was a well-kept 3-bedroom craftsman-style house with a detached garage and a small front yard. The neighborhood was mostly white, upper-middle class, and quiet. Whitmore had moved there with his wife and 2 daughters, and he truly loved the area. The schools were good, crime was low, and most neighbors were friendly. When he first moved in, he made an effort to introduce himself to everyone on the block. Most people welcomed him. A few seemed surprised that a black family had moved in, but Whitmore had experienced that kind of reaction before. He focused on being a good neighbor and didn't let it bother him. That Saturday morning in November, Whitmore was off work. He decided to wash his car, a dark blue sedan that was dirty after a week of rain. He pulled it into the driveway, grabbed a bucket and sponge, and started cleaning. The weather was perfect, sunny, light breeze, and temperatures in the mid-60s. Whitmore was wearing jeans, a gray t-shirt, and old sneakers. He had earbuds in, listening to music, fully relaxed and enjoying his day off. He was thinking about taking his daughters to the park later. He never heard the patrol car pull up behind him. At the same time, Castellano was driving through the Riverside neighborhood on routine patrol when his radio crackled. Dispatch reported a call about a suspicious person in the 2400 block of Maple Street. The caller stayed anonymous but claimed there was a black male acting suspiciously around vehicles. Castellano replied that he would respond and check it out. He drove down Maple Street, scanning the area. That's when he saw Whitmore in the driveway, washing his car. In just seconds, Castellano made several assumptions. First, he assumed Whitmore didn't live there. The neighborhood looked too nice, too expensive. Second, he assumed Whitmore might be checking cars to break into them. Third, he assumed this had to be the suspicious person the caller mentioned. He never stopped to think that Whitmore could actually own the house. He never thought about how washing your car in your own driveway on a Saturday morning is not suspicious at all. He didn't call dispatch for more details. He didn't slow down to reassess. He simply got out of his patrol car and walked toward Whitmore, his hand resting on his service weapon. Before we go any further, where are you watching from? Drop your country or state in the comments. And if you value stories that expose the truth about racial profiling, even inside law enforcement, make sure to hit the subscribe button. What happens next will shock you. Whitmore didn't notice Castellano until the officer was about 10 feet away. He pulled one earbud out and turned around. That's when he saw a uniformed officer approaching him with a serious face and a hand near his weapon. Whitmore's first thought was that something must have happened nearby. Maybe a break-in or an accident. He turned off the hose and walked toward Castellano, expecting a normal, professional interaction between two officers, even though Castellano didn't know who he was yet. But Castellano's first words were not professional. They were accusation disguised as a command. He said they had received a call about someone who didn't look like they belonged in the neighborhood and demanded to see Whitmore's ID. The words hit Whitmore hard. Someone who didn't look like they belonged. Not someone committing a crime. Not someone matching a suspect description. Just someone who didn't look like they belonged. Whitmore stayed calm and stated the obvious. He lived there. He was washing his car in his own driveway. It was a simple fact that should have ended the interaction immediately, but Castellano didn't apologize. He didn't step back or reconsider. He simply told Whitmore to cooperate and they'd be done, as if Whitmore was the problem, as if existing as a black man in a white neighborhood required proving yourself to police. Whitmore then asked the question hanging between them, "You're really going to do this?" It wasn't just about the ID. It was about whether Castellano was really choosing to engage in clear racial profiling, whether he was willing to stop someone based only on race. Castellano's response answered everything. He told Whitmore not to make it harder than it needed to be. The message was clear. Submit. Don't question. Don't assert your rights. Just comply. That's when Whitmore made his move. He identified himself by name and rank and said he was sure Castellano recognized the name. From Castellano's expression, it was obvious he didn't. Then Whitmore asked for Castellano's badge number and calmly told him he was in serious trouble. The body camera footage showed it all. Castellano's confident authority vanished instantly. His face went pale. His mouth opened, but no words came out. His hand dropped away from his weapon, and he took a step back without even realizing it. Whitmore let the silence sit for a moment, then spoke again. His voice was calm but firm. He asked for the badge number. Castellano, shaken, managed to say 2847. Whitmore then asked him to clearly explain what reasonable suspicion justified stopping someone washing a car in their own driveway. What exactly about the call made this stop lawful? Castellano tried to recover. He said he received a report about someone who looked suspicious. Whitmore asked exactly what the call had said. Castellano repeated the same words again, that someone didn't look like they belonged. Whitmore didn't let it slide. He pushed further. What about that made the person suspicious? What criminal activity was actually reported? Castellano had no real answer. Any explanation he gave led straight back to racial profiling. No crime had been reported. He hadn't seen any suspicious behavior. All he had was a call saying someone didn't look like they belonged, and what he saw was a black man washing a car. Whitmore then asked if Castellano had verified the address connected to the complaint. Castellano hadn't. He asked if Castellano had requested any additional details from dispatch. Castellano hadn't done that either. Whitmore asked if Castellano had personally observed any criminal behavior before approaching. Again, the answer was no. Then Whitmore asked the question that would become central to the investigation. He asked if the real reason for the stop was simply that Whitmore was a black man in a mostly white neighborhood, and that didn't look like they belonged was just another way of saying that. Castellano tried to deny it. He said it wasn't about race. He claimed he was just responding to a call about a suspicious person. Whitmore pressed again. What exactly was suspicious? Castellano repeated the same phrase. Someone didn't look like they belonged, but he couldn't explain how that created reasonable suspicion without admitting it was purely about race. So he tried to change tactics. He told Whitmore to just cooperate and this would be over. Whitmore's response was cold and precise. He explained that just cooperate is not a legal standard. Police officers are required to have reasonable suspicion to detain someone. Castellano still couldn't name any. The interaction continued for another 6 minutes. During that time, Whitmore calmly and methodically walked Castellano through every mistake he had made, every assumption, every policy violation, every constitutional issue. He explained that didn't look like they belonged is not reasonable suspicion of a crime. He explained that being black in a white neighborhood is not reasonable suspicion. He explained that anonymous calls without specific criminal behavior do not justify stops, unless officers independently verify something unlawful. Quick question for you watching. If you've ever been stopped or questioned by police while doing nothing wrong, type "it happens" in the comments. Let's show how common this really is. Castellano tried to downplay his actions. He said he was just following up on a call and doing his job. Whitmore responded that doing your job means investigating properly, not making assumptions based on race. Castellano said the caller sounded concerned. Whitmore asked what specific concern was mentioned. Castellano couldn't name one beyond someone not belonging. Then Castellano tried one last angle. He told Whitmore, cop to cop, that sometimes officers have to make quick judgments. Whitmore replied that quick judgments based only on race are still racial profiling and still unconstitutional, no matter who you are. By the end of the encounter, Castellano knew he was in serious trouble. Whitmore instructed him to return to the station immediately and report to the watch commander. He said he would be filing a formal complaint and initiating an internal investigation. Castellano's body camera had recorded everything. Whitmore had also recorded the interaction on his personal phone. Castellano drove back to the station in complete shock. He had just threatened his own sergeant. He had carried out clear racial profiling, and every second of it was documented. There was no way to explain this away. When Castellano arrived at the station, the watch commander was already waiting. Word had spread quickly. Whitmore had called ahead. Castellano was immediately placed on administrative leave pending investigation. His badge and service weapon were taken, and he was sent home with strict instructions not to discuss the case with anyone. The investigation began that same day. Internal Affairs assigned 2 senior investigators. The first thing they reviewed was Castellano's body camera footage. The video was devastating. You could clearly hear Castellano say, "We got a call about someone who didn't look like they belonged here." You could hear Whitmore calmly explain that he lived there and was washing his car in his own driveway. You could hear Castellano repeatedly telling him to just cooperate without offering any legal justification. The audio also captured Whitmore's controlled anger when he asked, "You're really going to do this?" And it recorded the exact moment everything shifted, when Whitmore identified himself as Sergeant Darnell Whitmore and told Castellano he was in serious trouble. Investigators then pulled Castellano's personnel file. That's when they found the 9 previous complaints. And now, for the first time, those complaints had context. This was not a single, one-time mistake. It was a pattern that had been ignored for years. Investigators reviewed Whitmore in detail, and he provided a clear and thorough statement. He explained that he had experienced racial profiling before as a civilian, but having it happen at the hands of one of his own officers while he was off duty was especially disturbing. He said it raised serious concerns about Castellano's judgment and whether this behavior had been part of his policing style throughout his entire career. 3 days later, investigators interviewed Castellano. He tried to justify what he had done. He said he was responding to a legitimate call. When investigators pointed out that the call included no specific address and no description beyond a black male, Castellano said he had to make a judgment call. They asked why he assumed Whitmore was the person from the call when Whitmore was clearly washing a car in a residential driveway. Castellano again repeated that the caller said someone didn't look like they belonged. When investigators pushed him to explain what that actually meant, Castellano couldn't give an answer that didn't come down to race. They then asked about his statement telling Whitmore to just cooperate. Castellano claimed he was trying to de-escalate the situation. Investigators corrected him. Demanding identification without legal justification is not de-escalation. It is escalation, and it is a violation of a person's rights. They asked Castellano whether he knew Whitmore was a sergeant when he first approached him. Castellano said, they then asked if knowing that would have changed how he handled the situation. Castellano answered probably. That answer said a lot. It meant he would have treated a white homeowner differently. It meant his actions were based on assumptions about who belonged in that neighborhood, not on any actual suspicious behavior. Investigators then reviewed the original call to dispatch. The anonymous caller had only said there was a black male on Maple Street who didn't look like he belonged and was acting suspicious around cars. The caller provided no exact address, no description of criminal activity, no details beyond race, a vague location, and the loaded phrase didn't look like he belonged. In other words, it was a textbook example of a racially biased call, the kind officers are trained to approach with caution, not immediately act on. Anonymous calls that combine race with vague language and no specific criminal behavior often come from people who see any person of color in their neighborhood as suspicious by default. Castellano should have asked for more information. He should have observed from a distance. He should have looked for actual criminal behavior. Instead, he saw a black man, assumed that was the problem. Investigators uncovered something else that was even more troubling. They reviewed dispatch records from Castellano's entire 4-year career. What they found showed a clear pattern. Castellano responded to suspicious person calls at a rate 40% higher than other officers in his district. Even more concerning, 87% of those calls involved people of color. There were only two possible explanations. Either Castellano somehow worked in areas with unusually high suspicious activity involving people of color, or he was actively seeking out situations that allowed him to stop people of color. The data strongly supported the second explanation. Do you think the department should have noticed this pattern earlier? Share your thoughts in the comments. The investigation lasted 7 weeks. During that time, investigators conducted 23 interviews, reviewed 14 hours of body camera footage from Castellano's past stops, and analyzed 4 years of dispatch records and incident reports. The findings were clear and undeniable. Castellano had violated department policy on racial profiling. He had conducted an investigatory stop without reasonable suspicion. He had failed to properly investigate before approaching a citizen, and he had made decisions based on race rather than behavior. But the investigation revealed something even bigger than this one incident. Investigators contacted the 9 people who had previously filed complaints against Castellano. 8 agreed to be interviewed. Their stories were strikingly similar. A 45-year-old black attorney named Jerome Buckley described being stopped by Castellano while jogging in a park near his home. Castellano demanded identification and questioned why Buckley was in the area. Buckley explained that he lived nearby and ran there several times a week. Castellano made him wait while he ran his name for warrants. None were found. Castellano then let him go, without an explanation and without an apology. A 32-year-old Latina small business owner named Alina Fuentes shared her experience. She said Castellano stopped her while she was loading equipment into her van outside her own store. Castellano accused her of stealing and demanded receipts for the equipment. Fuentes owned the store, and the equipment belonged to her. She showed Castellano her business license to prove it. Castellano claimed he was just being thorough. Fuentes later filed a complaint. It was marked unfounded. A 19-year-old black college student named Tyrell Washington shared a similar experience. He said Castellano stopped him while he was walking home from class around 8 p.m. Castellano asked where he was going, where he had been, and why he was in that neighborhood. Washington explained that he was a student and lived only 3 blocks away. Castellano then ordered him to empty his backpack on the sidewalk. Washington filed a complaint as well. That complaint was reviewed by Lieutenant Kowalski and dismissed as a lawful investigative stop. By this point, the pattern was impossible to ignore. Castellano repeatedly stopped people of color in situations that did not justify police stops. He regularly demanded identification without legal grounds, and he consistently treated people of color as if they did not belong in certain neighborhoods. More importantly, the investigation concluded that Castellano's previous complaints should have been taken seriously from the start. A pattern review showed that all 9 complaints described the same behavior. Castellano assuming people of color were out of place. Castellano demanding ID without legal justification. Castellano acting aggressively in situations that did not call for aggression. The investigation also revealed serious failures by Lieutenant Kowalski. His handling of Castellano's complaints was intentionally vague. His reports relied on generic phrases like officer, was conducting legitimate police work, or complainant misunderstood standard procedures, without actually examining whether the stops met constitutional standards. In 3 cases, Kowalski hadn't even interviewed Castellano before closing the complaints as unfounded. He simply reviewed Castellano's written reports and accepted them without question. In 2 other cases, Kowalski did interview Castellano, but failed to ask any difficult, meaningful questions about why the stops occurred, or whether racial bias played a role. Either Kowalski failed to see the pattern, or worse, he saw it and chose to ignore it. Investigators noted in their final report that Kowalski's lack of proper supervision allowed a problematic officer to continue violating citizens' rights for years. The investigators' recommendation was clear: termination. Castellano's union fought the decision. They argued that he had been responding to a legitimate call, and that while his actions may have been overly aggressive, they did not justify firing him. The department's response was direct and blunt. Castellano had racially profiled a sergeant. If he was willing to treat a superior officer that way, what was he doing to ordinary citizens who lacked the knowledge, authority, or resources to push back? The union's argument failed. Castellano was officially terminated 9 weeks after the incident. His appeal was denied. His law enforcement career was over at just 28 years old, but the consequences did not stop with Castellano. The department launched a full review of how civilian complaints had been handled. What they found was alarming. Under Lieutenant Kowalski's supervision, complaint investigations had been shallow at best. The review looked at 127 complaints Kowalski investigated during his final 5 years as a supervisor. Of those, 94 involved allegations of discrimination or excessive force. Kowalski found merit in only 3. The rest were dismissed as unfounded, unsubstantiated, or withdrawn by the complainant. Internal Affairs re-examined 30 of those cases using body camera footage and dispatch records that Kowalski had never reviewed. In 18 of them, investigators found clear patterns of problematic behavior. Officers making stops without reasonable suspicion, officers using force when it wasn't justified, officers making racially coded remarks. Kowalski's failure to properly investigate complaints didn't just protect Castellano. It protected multiple officers whose conduct should have been addressed years earlier. The department released a harsh public report criticizing Kowalski's supervision. The report stated that his failure to investigate complaints thoroughly allowed misconduct to continue unchecked throughout his division. Kowalski had retired 6 months before the Whitmore incident, so formal discipline was not possible. However, the department stripped him of his retirement ceremony honors in May. It clear that his legacy would be remembered as one of failed leadership. Several community leaders even called for him to return his pension, though that was not legally possible. The department also implemented sweeping reforms based on the investigation's findings. From that point forward, all complaints alleging racial profiling would be handled by internal affairs rather than division supervisors, eliminating the conflict of interest that had allowed Kowalski to protect his officers. All traffic and pedestrian stops would be reviewed quarterly to identify racial disparities. The department hired a full-time data analyst whose sole responsibility was to track stop data and flag officers whose patterns could not be explained by legitimate factors. Body camera footage from investigatory stops would now be randomly audited. 5% of all stops each month would be selected at random and reviewed by a team of supervisors and community representatives to ensure policies were being followed. The department also created a civilian review board with real authority. Previous oversight boards had only advisory power. The new board could compel testimony, access all records, and issue binding disciplinary recommendations for sustained complaints. Officers were now required to complete 16 hours of implicit bias training every year. This replaced the old 2-hour online module that officers could rush through without engagement. The new training was in person, interactive, and included realistic scenarios designed to force officers to confront their own biases. Finally, the department introduced an early warning system to identify problematic behavior before it escalated. If an officer received 3 complaints alleging similar conduct within a single year, even if none were officially sustained, they would be automatically flagged for extra supervision and additional training. Whitmore played a key role in creating the new training program focused on implicit bias and racial profiling. He chose to share his own experience, including the body camera footage, as part of the training. Officers watched a respected sergeant get profiled by one of their own. It was uncomfortable to watch, and that was exactly the point. The training didn't stop with Whitmore's incident. Officers were also shown body camera footage from several of Castellano's previous stops. They watched him stop the attorney while jogging. They saw him harass the business owner outside her own store. They watched him force a college student to empty his backpack on the sidewalk. After each clip, trainers asked a simple question: what reasonable suspicion did Castellano have in this situation? Every time, the answer was the same: none. The only thing connecting all the stops was the race of the person being questioned. Whitmore also became a strong advocate for officers of color within the department. As he spoke out, he learned he wasn't alone. Several black officers shared their own experiences of being stopped by fellow officers while off duty, questioned about why they were in certain neighborhoods, and treated like suspects instead of colleagues. Whitmore responded by starting a mentoring program that paired experienced officers of color with new recruits. He worked closely with command staff to address discrimination and bias within the department. He pushed for greater diversity in hiring and promotions. The incident had exposed deep problems inside the institution, and Whitmore was determined to help change the culture. Castellano's termination quickly drew media attention. Local news outlets covered the story of an officer fired for racially profiling his own sergeant. The story spread rapidly on social media. After the investigation ended, the body camera footage was released publicly and viewed millions of times. Comment sections filled with people sharing their own stories. Black professionals stopped in their own neighborhoods. Latino business owners questioned inside their own stores. Asian Americans followed by security in upscale shops. The story resonated because it showed that profiling can happen to anyone, regardless of education, career, or status. Even a decorated police sergeant was not immune to suspicion simply for being black in a white neighborhood. Castellano gave one interview after he was fired. He said he believed he had been treated unfairly and insisted he was just responding to a call and doing his job. When asked whether he understood why Whitmore had been offended, his answer was hesitant and unclear, showing he still didn't fully understand the issue. He never apologized to Whitmore, not in private and not in public. 6 months later, Castellano moved out of state and took a job in construction. His wife later filed for divorce, citing the stress of his termination and his refusal to take responsibility for his actions. Whitmore continued serving as a sergeant. 3 years after the incident, he was promoted to lieutenant. Today, he is a respected voice in the Department on Community Relations, Fair Policing. The house on Maple Street is still his home. He still washes his car in the driveway on Saturday mornings. But now, when patrol cars drive by, officers wave. They know who he is. They know what happened, and they understand that assumptions based on race carry real consequences. The incident became a powerful case study showing how racial profiling can exist even inside institutions that should know better. It proved that having anti-discrimination policies means nothing if they are not enforced. It showed that complaints must be taken seriously and patterns must be recognized early. Most importantly, it revealed that racial profiling doesn't only harm the people being profiled. It destroys trust in law enforcement, damages department reputations, and ends careers when bias replaces judgment. Marcus Whitmore washing his car that Saturday morning was doing something millions of people do every weekend. The only thing that made him suspicious was the color of his skin, and the officer who couldn't see past that lost everything. The lesson is simple but powerful. When you assume someone doesn't belong because of their race, when you approach them with suspicion based only on appearance, when bias replaces facts, you are not doing good police work. You are practicing discrimination. And sooner or later, whether the person you profile is a sergeant, a lawyer, a teacher, or an ordinary citizen, the truth comes out. The pattern becomes undeniable, and the consequences become real. Castellano thought he was investigating a suspicious person. What he was actually revealing were his own biases. He believed his badge gave him the authority to demand identification from anyone he personally felt was out of place. What he learned was that looking out of place based on race is not reasonable suspicion. The body camera footage from that November morning is still used in training sessions across the country, not just in police departments, but in discussion about implicit bias, racial profiling, and the importance of examining our own assumptions. Every time someone watches that video, they see the exact moment an officer's career ends. They see his face when he realizes the man he was profiling is his supervisor. They hear the excuses fall apart, and they witness accountability in action. If this story opened your eyes to how racial profiling works, even within law enforcement, please share it. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories that expose injustice and hold people accountable. Drop a comment and tell me what you learned from this story. Your engagement helps these stories reach people who need to hear them. Thanks for watching till the end.